3 weeks before 87 expensive homes nearly turned into a lake. I did something my neighbors still bring up whenever my name comes up at the grocery store. I put a heavy steel lock on a storm drain, smiled, climbed back into my pickup, and drove home like it was just another Tuesday. Sounds crazy, right? Well, if that's all you knew, I'd probably think I was the villain too. But nothing about what happened started with that lock. It started years earlier, with people who believed that owning the houses uphill somehow gave them ownership over everyone living below them. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 58 years old, born and raised in western Pennsylvania, and for the last 19 years I've lived at the very bottom of a hillside neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates. Funny thing about living downhill? Gravity makes you everyone's problem. Water runs downhill, snow gets pushed downhill, leaves blow downhill, and apparently so does responsibility. My place isn't fancy. It's an old cedar-sided home my late wife Emily and I bought because she loved the giant maple trees surrounding it. We couldn't afford one of those oversized houses with 3-car garages and heated driveways sitting on top of the ridge, but we had something better. Peace, birds in the morning, deer wandering through the backyard, and enough quiet to hear rain hitting the roof. At least that's how it used to be. Most people driving through Cedar Ridge never noticed my property because they were too busy admiring the million-dollar homes above. What they didn't realize was that almost every drop of rain and melting snow flowing through that development eventually passed across one small piece of my land before disappearing into a creek behind my woods. Right beside my gravel driveway sat a 24-inch storm drain. Nothing glamorous, just concrete, steel, and decades of engineering doing exactly what it was designed to do. The subdivision had an easement giving them the legal right to route their drainage through my property. I never had a problem with that. Water doesn't care about property lines, but the easement came with one simple condition. The homeowners association had to keep the drain accessible and properly maintained. That sentence would end up costing them a fortune. Every winter, the HOA hired the same snow removal company, Ridgeway Property Services. They always rushed through storms because every extra hour meant less profit. Instead of hauling excess snow away, they pushed it toward the lowest point available, my yard. At first, it didn't seem like a huge deal. A pile here, another there. I'd grumble while clearing my driveway, maybe mutter something under my breath, then move on with my day. But every year the piles got bigger. Every year they landed a little closer to the drain. Every year I mentioned it to someone from the HOA, and every year I got the same polite smile that really meant, "Thanks for your opinion. Now please go away." Things changed after Emily passed away. Losing your wife after 31 years has a strange way of changing what you're willing to tolerate. Before, she'd squeeze my hand and tell me not to waste my energy fighting stubborn people. After she was gone, the Simons in that house gave me too much time to notice everything. Every leak, every crack, every little sign that people thought they could walk all over you if nobody stood beside you anymore. The winter everything exploded started with record snowfall. Storm after storm rolled through the valley, and every time I looked outside another white mountain had appeared beside my driveway. By late January, I could barely see the drain anymore. By mid-February, it had disappeared completely beneath a frozen wall of compacted snow nearly 12 feet high. I remember standing there one cold morning with a shovel in my hand, staring at that mountain and feeling something deep in my stomach that wasn't anger. It was certainty. I knew exactly what was going to happen when temperatures climbed above freezing. I grabbed my phone, took pictures from every angle, measured the height, recorded videos, and emailed them to the HOA manager. No response. 2 days later, I called the board president, Richard Holloway. He answered, sounding annoyed before I'd even finished saying hello. I explained the drain was buried, reminded him about the easement, and suggested they remove the snow before spring arrived. He laughed, then said, "Daniel, that's where the snow has always gone. It'll melt eventually. You'll be fine." I looked back at that frozen mountain outside my kitchen window and quietly answered, "No, Richard, I won't." Then I hung up. Standing there in that silent kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hand, I had the unmistakable feeling that this wasn't going to end with a simple phone call. I just didn't know yet how expensive that lesson was about to become. Richard was wrong about one thing. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, just enough warm afternoons to loosen the ice, followed by freezing nights that locked everything back together. The problem was, every hour that giant pile softened, thousands of gallons of meltwater searched for somewhere to go. And because the drain underneath 12 feet of packed snow couldn't breathe, all that water started backing up exactly where physics said it would, into my basement. The first flood happened on a Saturday morning. I walked downstairs carrying a basket of laundry and stepped into freezing water halfway up my boots. At first my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I heard it. The slow dripping from the furnace, the humming of overloaded equipment, cardboard boxes collapsing as they soaked through. I spent 12 straight hours pumping water, dragging ruined boxes outside, calling my insurance company, and trying to save anything that still mattered. Most of what got destroyed wasn't expensive. It was worse than expensive. Emily's handwritten recipes, our camping journals from the early 90s, Christmas ornaments we'd wrapped in newspaper every year, old photo albums I promised myself I would digitize someday. Water doesn't care about memories. It destroys everything equally. I documented every inch of damage anyway, every soaked wall, every warped shelf, every ruined receipt I could still read. My insurance adjuster shook his head before he even finished walking through the basement. "This isn't random flooding," he said. "Something upstream isn't draining." Those words stayed with me. 2 weeks later, another warm spell rolled through. I hadn't even finished repairing the first mess before it happened again. This time I watched it start outside. Water spread across my backyard like someone had turned on a giant faucet. It circled around the buried snow pile, climbed over the grass, then found every weak point around the foundation. I called the HOA office while watching water creep toward my basement windows. Their receptionist transferred me 3 times before I finally reached Melissa Grant, the community operations director. I explained everything again. She sighed loud enough for me to hear it through the phone. "Mr. Mercer, snow removal decisions are made by our contractor." "Your contractor works for you," I answered. "Then perhaps you should call them." "No," I replied. "I'm calling the people whose names are on the easement." Silence. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Honestly, Daniel, you benefit from that drainage system too." I looked around at water pouring into my basement for the second time and almost laughed. Benefit. That word echoed in my head for days. The third flood happened during the first week of March, and by then I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot but burns out. What replaced it was something much colder: clarity. I stopped reacting emotionally and started behaving like an investigator building a case. I ordered certified copies of the original easement agreement from the county archives. I spent an afternoon reading every page, highlighting every maintenance obligation, every definition of access, every responsibility assigned to the homeowners association. There it was in black and white. The easement remained valid only if unrestricted access to the drainage infrastructure was maintained by the benefiting party. I probably read that sentence 20 times. Then I hired a civil engineer named Alan Prescott to inspect the site. Alan wasn't interested in HOA politics. He walked the property with measuring equipment, photographed everything, and finally stood beside the buried drain with his clipboard tucked under one arm. "If this blockage stays until full thaw," he said, "you're looking at neighborhood-wide surface flooding." "How bad?" I asked. He slowly looked uphill toward the rows of expensive homes. "Very bad." "Can you put that in writing?" He smiled. "Already planning ahead?" "I'm tired of conversations," I said. "From now on, I want paperwork." Over the next 10 days, my dining room table disappeared beneath documents, repair estimates, engineering reports, insurance statements, photos sorted by date, drone images taken by my nephew showing exactly where every load of snow had been dumped all winter. Every time another invoice arrived, I added it to a growing folder labeled simply Cedar Ridge. Meanwhile, life inside the neighborhood carried on as though nothing had happened. Luxury SUVs rolled past my driveway every morning. Kids waited for school buses. Dog walkers smiled politely without realizing the only thing standing between their dry streets and a very expensive disaster was a drain buried under a mountain their own HOA had created. Eventually, I requested to speak during the monthly board meeting. Richard looked irritated the second I walked into the clubhouse carrying 2 binders. The room smelled like coffee and fresh paint. About 20 homeowners sat in folding chairs while board members occupied a long table at the front. Richard forced a smile. "Daniel, you have 5 minutes." "That's plenty." I placed 1 binder in front of each board member. "Inside, you'll find photographs, engineering reports, insurance documentation, county easement records, and invoices covering 3 separate flood events." Richard didn't even open his copy. "What's your point?" "My point," I answered calmly, "is that every page in those binders costs you money. Melissa flipped through the engineering report. Alan's conclusion was highlighted in yellow. She stopped smiling. Richard finally opened his binder. These damages aren't necessarily our responsibility. Then whose contractor buried the drain? I asked. Nobody answered. Who ignored 3 written notices? Still silence. Who is legally required to maintain unrestricted access? Richard leaned back in his chair. Are you threatening the association? I looked around the room before answering. No. I'm giving the association an opportunity to solve a problem before spring solves it for you. Several homeowners exchanged nervous looks. They hadn't known about the flooding. They certainly hadn't known about the easement. Richard ended the discussion by promising the board would review the documents with legal counsel. As I packed my binders, one older homeowner quietly approached me near the exit. My name's Frank, he whispered. They've been cutting corners on maintenance for years. Then he slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. After I got home, I unfolded it. It contained dates, contractor names, internal maintenance schedules, and one handwritten sentence that changed everything. Snow disposal redirected to Mercer property to reduce hauling costs. Approved by board vote. I stared at those words for a long time. So it wasn't laziness. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad communication. They had intentionally chosen my yard because it saved money. Somehow that hurt more than the flooding itself. The next morning, I called the local metal fabrication shop. I asked one simple question. Can you build me a custom steel cover for a 24-inch storm drain? The owner chuckled. That's an unusual request. Trust me, I said. It's about to become a very important one. 4 days later, 2 welders arrived with a 1/4-inch steel grate reinforced with heavy crossbars, industrial hinges, and a weatherproof locking mechanism that looked more appropriate for a construction site than a residential backyard. They bolted it directly into the surrounding concrete while I watched every anchor tightened into place. When they finished, I snapped a heavy brass padlock shut, tugged on it twice, then mounted a bright aluminum sign beside the drain. DRAN closed due to easement violation. As I stood there looking at that locked grate, I wasn't smiling because I thought I'd won. I was smiling because, for the first time in months, the next move belonged to them. The phone rang before lunchtime. Richard's voice sounded completely different from the confident man who had laughed at me a month earlier. There was no arrogance left, only urgency carefully disguised as professionalism. Daniel, we'd like to discuss a reasonable solution. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the kitchen window toward the locked grate sitting quietly beneath the melting snow. That's interesting, I said. Last month he told me I'd be fine. He cleared his throat. There's no need to make this personal. I almost laughed. Richard, you flooded my basement 3 times. It became personal long before I bought a padlock. An hour later he arrived with Melissa and the HOA's attorney. They stepped carefully across the muddy yard, all 3 stopping a few feet from the steel cover as if it were somehow dangerous. Richard pointed at the lock. You can't block infrastructure serving the neighborhood. Actually, I replied, holding up a copy of the easement agreement. I can suspend access when the benefiting party materially breaches its maintenance obligations. Your lawyer has probably already explained that. The attorney said nothing. That silence told me everything. Richard tried another approach. The homeowners are getting worried. They should be. You're punishing 87 families. I shook my head. No. Your board did that when it decided my property was cheaper than paying to haul snow away. Melissa finally spoke, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. What exactly do you want? I handed them a folder. Inside was a settlement proposal, not written out of anger, but out of months of invoices, engineering reports, and legal research. They would reimburse every dollar of documented damage, including basement repairs, excavation costs, destroy personal property, engineering inspections, and the custom steel grate. They would sign a 15-year maintenance agreement requiring annual compensation for hosting the drainage easement, quarterly inspections with written reports, and advance approval of every future snow disposal plan affecting my property. Most importantly, any future violation would immediately suspend their drainage access until the issue was corrected. Richard flipped through the pages, stopped halfway, and looked at me in disbelief. You expect us to agree to this? No, I answered calmly. I expect your insurance company to explain why you should. The next 48 hours were strangely quiet. Then the weather forecast changed. 3 straight days of heavy rain followed by rapid snowmelt. Local meteorologists started talking about possible flash flooding throughout the county. Suddenly, trucks began driving slowly through Cedar Ridge. Homeowners stood at the ends of their driveways staring downhill toward my property. Word had spread. Nobody was talking about me anymore. They were talking about water. By the second afternoon, puddles had already begun forming along the lowest streets. Nothing catastrophic yet, just enough standing water to remind everyone how quickly things could change. I noticed neighbors who had barely spoken to me in years now, waving as they drove by. One elderly couple even stopped to apologize. We honestly had no idea what the board had been doing, the husband admitted. I believed him. Most people simply trusted their HOA to make responsible decisions. They never imagined cost-cutting decisions were being made at someone else's expense. Late that evening, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Richard. It was the HOA's attorney. His tone was direct and surprisingly respectful. Mr. Mercer, the board has voted to accept your settlement in full. For a second, I didn't answer. After months of arguments, excuses, and blame shifting, the fight ended with one sentence. He continued, "Payment will be wired tomorrow morning. The maintenance agreement has been signed by all parties." I thanked him, hung up, and just sat there in silence. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't revenge either. Mostly it was relief. Relief that I wouldn't spend another spring tearing out soaked drywall. Relief that Emily's house would finally stop paying the price for someone else's shortcuts. The wire transfer arrived before noon the next day. Every dollar, not reduced, not negotiated. Every single cent. A week later, the first annual easement payment cleared as well. Then something happened that I never expected. Ridgeway Property Services showed up with excavators, loaders, and a completely different crew. They removed every remaining pile of compacted snow, cleaned the drainage channel from end to end, replaced damaged concrete around the inlet, and even reseeded the sections of my yard they'd destroyed over the winter. Richard never supervised the work. In fact, I never saw him again after the settlement meeting. Rumor around town was that several homeowners demanded a special election after learning how the board had handled the drainage issue. Whether that was true or not, I honestly don't know. I had stopped paying attention to neighborhood politics. Every few months, I still walked down to that drain with my inspection checklist, unlock the cover while maintenance crews performed their work, then lock it again before heading back to the house. Some people think the lock is about revenge. They're wrong. The lock isn't there to keep water out. It's there to remind everyone that agreements only work when both sides honor them. Property rights aren't complicated. Respect isn't complicated. If someone benefits from your land, your time, or your trust, the least they can do is uphold the promises they signed their names to. Looking back now, I realized the biggest mistake Richard and his board made wasn't burying that drain. It was assuming that because I lived alone in the smallest house at the bottom of the hill, I'd eventually give up. They mistook quiet for weakness, patience for surrender, and kindness for permission. They couldn't have been more wrong. So now, I want to hear from you. Was I justified in locking that drain after everything that happened? Or should I have unlocked it and trusted the HOA one more time? If you were in my shoes, where would you have drawn the line? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that's exactly why these conversations matter. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had to deal with an HOA that forgot the difference between authority and accountability.